Okay, so thank you everyone for coming, getting up early or staying up late, wherever you are in the world. It's a pleasure. I'm a bit croaky. I've got a really bad cough, but I've got loads of cough mixture, etc. So I do apologise for the state of my voice. I also apologise for the plethora of slides that I have. I never learn. I've been teaching for 15 years and I just think I should be fired, but I've just got way too many slides, way too much information, but I'll try and give everyone gaps so we can kind of have a discussion. So my slides are there as prompts really to kind of facilitate some chat. And as you can see from the slide, straight away, the title is ridiculous, but I keep thinking about changing it, but I like it because it just got so much packed in there. And that's what my thesis is really, is just this huge complex beast that hopefully will finish one day. So I'm here today to talk about my thesis work. And my thesis title at the moment is something along the lines of this slide. So I'm looking at disciplines and assessment culture ultimately. And the work I've done is look at academics' perceptions of assessment, so what they think about assessment and maybe what makes them think in that way. And I've kind of got this paradox or this dichotomy or this big question around whether we're sustainably assessing the unbridled pursuit of truth in this kind of liberal sense, or are we this teach to the test, knowledge factory, sweatshop type idea? And there's undertones in there of neoliberalism and kind of this battle between the liberal Humboldtian type model and the kind of neoliberal university and that kind of contestation. And there's a hashtag selling your soul for a 2-1 because I think there's a lot of like the consumerism discourse that comes out through that as well. So it's all in there and probably too much. So I'll just do a little introduction. I'll just tell you kind of what I'm hoping to gain from the next few minutes. And I do speak really quickly, so please do just jump in, but I'll just try and get through my slides really and what I've got to show you. So I was a senior lecturer in the business school. I'm an accountant. And when I come to show you my findings and how I've analysed them, you'll see that I'm a rigorous auditor and I can't let anything go uncoded. And that is a huge failing. But I'm like that's the positivist side of me, is that I want logic, I want explanation, I want causality, I want completeness. So just to put that kind of in your minds, really. So I was an accounting lecturer and now I'm an education developer, still in the same institution. So what I'll do today, just kind of briefly go through, like set the scene around my problem for my thesis, just very briefly, really briefly talk about some assessment literature, but mostly get straight on to autonomy and how I've used autonomy and the questions I've got for you around autonomy to see how I've used my translation device and whether it all makes sense to you. So yeah, so it is the nitty-gritty stuff I'm after today, really, looking at the translation device, looking at the coding, looking at initial findings, because I'm not yet finished with my coding, which is ridiculous because I've got 6 months left, so I've got to get onto it. So just to start off, everyone, I've got a quote here. So a quote about assessment. So if you've gone to an assessment conference, kind of read any literature, this might sound quite familiar. So a statement about intent of assessment, what assessment should be. So assessment should be integral component of instruction, kind of collaborative environments, active participants, meaningful, authentic engagement with the discipline, creating evaluative expertise. So I just wonder now if anyone can just unmute themselves and just say whether you agree with that. Any thoughts around that?
Well, I can see that this statement clearly aligns itself with one end of the axiological spectrum, right? All these buzzwords.
Yeah, you're getting straight in there, definitely. And it was Bruce McFarlane wrote something quite recently on like the sacred and the profane and how some of those buzzwords have now become the kind of the sacred in HE speak, but they might have more profane underpinnings. But does everyone kind of agree with this, or at least is familiar with this?
Sorry, sorry to interrupt. Is this the saying that within collaborative learning environments, assessment should be integral? Was saying assessment should be within collaborative learning environments? I mean, if it's the latter, then, well, no, I mean, if it's the latter, it just seems to be, just an argument for collaborative learning, student, blah, blah, blah. Student-centered learning, basically, again.
Yeah.
It looks like it's saying, you know, we shouldn't have assessment outside of that.
Yeah, and I think it's just a whole combination of factors and combination of these kind of constructs of what assessment should be. So it's trying to capture everything. And I've kind of broached all of these factors about having some collaboration, being authentic, etc., having kind of feedback and formative assessment for student learning, and doesn't mention student agency, but I think that's a bit implicit in terms of evaluative expertise. So I've bunched all these up as what I would call assessment for learning or assessment as learning, a kind of, as Pavel mentioned, a new paradigm or a new kind of the more innovative means of looking at assessment. And that is usually in contrast with the kind of traditional notion of assessment and assessment of learning. So that's what I've called blue sky thinking in terms of my little visual here. So I've got another slide. So this is what I've called corridor talk. So statements such as students don't care about feedback, they just want the grade. They're just interested in the degree. They want to be spoon-fed. I'm just going to do an exam because students are going to cheat. We can't make changes because of the regulations, it's so bureaucratic. Group work's too difficult. Students should be able to write an essay, don't have workload allowance. I'm not bowing to outside influences, etc. So how many people have kind of either heard that, said that, agree with that, disagree with that? Any comments?
Natalie, I think you were standing in my corridor when you overheard all of these things. That's all I have to say. Clearly.
Yeah, and this is anecdotal, by the way. So these statements are just anecdotal at the moment. It's more just it's being provocative, because I think as much as we might want to think blue skies thinking, and we might agree with the previous slide, there are these undertones, there are these dark discourses, there are these kind of corridor talks or these subtle thoughts, or maybe they're even voiced in kind of university HE speak, and maybe they come out in more neoliberal kind of publications and things like that, but they are there. And I think it's this constant tension, if you like, between this blue skies thinking and these kind of more darker thoughts. So
when you say blue skies, Natalie, when you say blue sky thinking stroke darker thought, are you talking about the difference between, say, like kind of rhetoric and reality, the difference between, say, more ideologically based stuff, where, for example, if you get someone doing, you know, like a talk about, oh, this is what you should do with your students, it's always this you know, it's a kind of the education equivalent of kind of rivers of chocolate and rainbows and unicorns. Yeah. Everything's great, and then not realizing that, you know, I'm looking at the numbers of students I've got and thinking, how do I minimize the work that I do to fit it in to the time that I have? And how do I not screw over my tutor, for example, who is only paid a certain amount of minutes per assessment by a university that's engaged in, or claims not to have done, but the unions have accused of systematic wage theft from, you know, tutors and other people who are doing marking and so on. It's like they want you to do all this stuff that's, you know, very time intensive, but on the other hand, you just don't have the time. And you know, sometimes sometimes does the rhetoric match the reality. And one of the things that came out from my study that I don't think I wrote anywhere for my PhD was that if you look at, I looked at all the debates about the creation of new universities in the early 1960s. And one of the fascinating things to me, which I'm sure never got into my PhD because there was no time or space, was that in each one of the discussions about university and the ideal pedagogic size of seminars, which were first brought up in that sort of place for England anyway, instead of it just being lectures and so on, it always seemed to match the level of the budget available for that university. So if it was like 12, 15, 10 and comparative, then I tried to do a kind of comparative analysis of what roughly the budget would have been for this sort of thing at a guess. And it always seemed to match that the more budget they had, the more staff they could get for the students. They would be able to say, we think the ideal number of students in a seminar, in a workshop or whatever, is this number. And so the rhetoric then matched we're sort of running off the back of the pragmatic reality. But are you saying there's a kind of like a clash between those two?
Yeah. And so you might go to an assessment conference and come out as very enthusiastic, all these lovely ideas you want to implement, but actually you get crushed under the kind of the weight of reality, essentially. And it's also about change, so change in assessment. So if we're going to assessment conferences or being told we've got to change, we've got to innovate, we've got to move towards this blue sky thinking, but we're constantly in this corridor, and it's about, do we want to change? So ultimately what I'm looking at is kind of what legitimates an academic assessment practice in a given field. So are we kind of legitimizing what we're doing at the moment as being right, and we're not wanting to change, or we can't change? Like, what are those barriers to change, and how do we feel about it, really? So my project is around understanding who drives assessment and for what purposes. So are those purposes quite liberal Humboldtian ideas around assessment, or are those purposes other ideas around maybe more neoliberal conditions around assessing just to get through the actual task that we have to manage in our day-to-day lives, if you like. So just getting through the marking, or more darker undertones than that, really. So whether assessment is just seen as a certification exercise for exemptions for students to get their qualification, to get out of uni as quickly as they can. So as I kind of go through, I'll probably like generalize quite a lot and use some of these quite provocative ideas, but they are there in the literature, and they also do come out in some of the data that I've got. So my research is mostly around influences on assessment and perspectives on assessment. So in terms of influences, I just want to ensure that I'm addressing assessment as a social practice and understanding the complexities of all of these constraints and these factors that actually influence an academic's practice. And when I talk about an academic, I'm having an underlying assumption that there is some agency in what academics do, because they're the people on the front line. They're usually the people, I say usually, designing assessment, enacting assessment. If you looked at kind of Bernstein's pedagogic device, they're almost in every one of those three different areas of activity. So a lot falls on our, as academics, heads, if you like. So I want to understand this kind of the social context a little bit more and the influences on assessment practice, but then also understand how academics think of assessment practice and whether they agree with that blue sky thinking anyway. So in the literature, the kind of blue sky thinking assessment for and as learning involves a myriad of different things. I've just put a load on here. I'm not going to put references, but I've got references for all of these things. So we're constantly trying to be more diverse, more inclusive, more transformative, include more formative assessment. Summative assessment is kind of demonized. We're trying to embrace students as partners, as co-creators in assessment, and that can be quite controversial as well. Collaboration, authentic assessment, so making sure your assessment's aligned with employability. Doesn't necessarily align with every academic's agenda on what they think assessment should be doing, whether it's a kind of pursuit around employability or that more liberal pursuit. So there's a whole host of things that probably we're told we should be doing, but they're not happening in practice. And I want to kind of understand that. So when I say they're not happening in practice, I've just shown some early evidence from Case University, which is where I did some research, this piece of research for my doctorate. And I looked at two different programs. So one was accounting and finance in the business school, and one was business management in a business school. And you can see differences in practice. And this comes out in the disciplinary literature as well. There are differences in disciplinary practices when you look at the hard disciplines and the soft disciplines. But I'll hopefully come to say that that is a little bit, I won't use the term epistemologically, like epistemological essentialism, if you like. I don't just want to take those disciplinary categories and say, everyone always does this or everyone always does that, because I think you need to scratch the surface and look at the social practices below them. But saying that, if you look at these disciplines, then accounting has kind of 6 different types of assessment in a 3-year program, and 83% of it is exam. So it's kind of, you push your students through those exams, 6 in the autumn, 6 in the summer, and that's kind of it, really. Whereas business management has a lot more different diverse types of assessment, maybe a lot more reflection, a lot more learning logs, a lot more assessment related to transferable skills, if you like. And so they're a lot more diverse. and they have maybe a little bit more formative assessment. So ultimately, I'm using LCT autonomy to address both influences and perceptions. So I put this up kind of first with some feedback from the lovely WITS group yesterday. So I'll go into a little bit about what autonomy is, but I just wanted to say this is how I'm using it. So in terms of autonomy, I'm using positional autonomy as relating to the insulation and the boundaries around an academic's assessment practice. So does an academic have agency and academic freedom in setting their assessments and designing their assessments? Or does the influence on assessment come from beyond the academic? So maybe it comes from accreditation bodies, maybe there's influence from management, maybe there's influence from the wider market, if you like, in terms of trying to appease students for student satisfaction, NSS in the UK league tables, for example. Relational autonomy then is the ways in which constituents, and so constituents are kind of academics, or constituents are actors who have a source of influence in assessment for me. And relational autonomy is the ways of working, the principles, the practices, and the beliefs around assessment. So if those beliefs and those principles are educational, so assessment should be for learning, so for based around the student, then that would be stronger relational autonomy. Whereas if those practices are more heteronymous, so if they're aimed towards the outside, or if those practices are for other reasons, like just marking for efficiency purposes, so setting an exam because it's more efficient to mark, then that would be weaker relational autonomy. And if it's just assessment viewed as certification or credentialism with no learning, then that would also be weaker relational autonomy. So I'll go through a little bit about how I developed the translation device and how I developed this plane, but that's where I am at the moment. So I don't know whether it's worth just taking a breather there. And I'll explain it all as we go. Is everyone all right with that so far? Yeah. And you might...
Michael, can you go one slide back, please?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, some of those decisions, it all so you're saying if they're driven by education, right, then relational autonomy is stronger. If there's something outside of education, then it's weaker autonomy. Like, it all depends on how these influences are formulated, right? You can have a formulation such as support authentic learning and prepares students for the world outside of academia, for example. Then what do you do with this kind of goal formulation? You put it somewhere in the middle, like around where the axes intersect, like 0.0, or...
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll take you through my translation device, and obviously with autonomy you need a target, and the target emerges from the data. So I will take you through kind of how I develop those differences, but at the very kind of top scale, that's what I'm looking at really. And in terms of what is educational and what is an autonomous principle in autonomy and being able to plot that, then there is contestation. So I have to set a target, kind of pin down a target, and then I've got to find a way of looking at strengths away from that target in order to plot them across the relational and the positional plane as well. So it is a big problem, and I know there's been somebody, like Carl probably said yourself, around trying not to draw a map as big as the world, but trying to understand assessment perspectives and assessment problems. That's what I'm really trying to do. So I'm trying to capture everything, all of those perspectives and all of those influences. So some of the outputs, I thought I'd give you a sneaky peek before I go into more depth. Some of the outputs, really, what I've tried to do is use autonomy to give people individual autonomous profiles. So in my interviews, and I've done 28 of them, they're not all coded, which is why I'm struggling for getting this done in 6 months. But what I've done is I've coded every interview and then plotted their responses on this autonomy plane based on that previous kind of simplified version, if you like. And what I'm hoping to see is the patterns, really, and maybe where some of the perspectives of assessment sit the most. So for example, this is one individual, I'll go through a few now, but there's not much going on in the kind of sovereign quadrant around this individual having academic freedom in their assessment and it being for learning, there's a little bit more going on around this exotic quadrant, whereby this individual feels they don't have academic freedom. There is outside pressure, and that outside pressure is leading to assessment practices that are not predominantly aimed at the students and their learning. Now, I'm not going to say one is good and one is bad, because there's not value or charging in autonomy. It's just strengths away from a different position. So I don't want you to feel that it's all bad, because there are some things in here that we have to do in order to get by, for example, in negative relational autonomy. So marking with a focus on reliability or something like that might sit within here. But it's just using individual profiles to kind of see the lay of the land, really. And then what I was hoping to do with those, what I've done with those, is to amalgamate them all. So everyone has an individual profile, and then I cluster up all of these different profiles in a way of trying to see clusters, patterns of perspectives and patterns of beliefs, and where they sit on that plane. So if the majority of academics thought they had freedom and assessment was for learning, then they'd be right up in the sovereign. If the majority of academics saw that their freedom was threatened and the practices were not really focused on student learning, then there'd be clusters in the exotic. If there are clusters up in this projected area, then the academic does have agency, but is undertaking assessment practices and has assessment principles that are really focused on not primarily that student learning. And I found that there is a cluster up here, and it's what we have to do as academics to get through our daily lives, really. And then this bottom introjected quadrant is around influence coming from outside, but for learning purposes. So kind of co-working with industry, co-working with students, co-working with management, having lots of management influence, and creating assessments that are for learning or for student education. So that's what I did. And I just wanted to kind of show you up front. Sorry, Lee.
Sorry. Yeah, just remind us, the blue and the orange, is that the accounting versus the business studies?
No, so the blue and the orange, sorry. The blue is normative perspective. So as I've got too many slides, but once I get through to the next couple of slides, I had to kind of split out perceptions into perceptions of what should be. So assessment should be for learning, and academics should have full autonomy and full academic freedom. Or in the interview, somebody might say assessment is not under my control, or it is under my control, or assessment is usually based on some other principle not for learning. So I had to split out normative, so what assessment should be or should not be, between actual, what assessment is or is not. So blue is normative and orange is actual. And I put them on the same map here, and I've got separate maps for them a bit later, but I just amalgamated everything, because what I think is quite useful is being able to see the code matches where actually the rhetoric, what assessment should be, can actually match what assessment is. And so it's quite nice to see those overlaps. And you can see some in the introjected there where...
Natalie?
Yeah.
Is this, so I think you told us that you were giving this a kind of a sneak peek or something.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've got super condensed amounts of information here I don't know how to understand yet. But you're going to unpack that and make sense of it later.
Yeah, I'll just move on so you can see. So that's the output, really.
Like, oh my God, I've missed a load of things and I don't know what I'm looking at.
No, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of what's to come, so it gets your mind racing now, and then hopefully as I go through I'll kind of answer any questions that you might have. But so that's the output, and then I'll show you how I got there. So in terms of how I got there,
sorry, can we go back one slide? Sorry.
Yeah.
So what I can see here is that the kinds of assessment are all over the quadrant, right? And that does not really match the definition of what assessment should be, right? That's what you presented at the very beginning, right? So so the blue sky thing, the aspiration is one thing, and then here is the reality, right? It's just everywhere. And a question I would have is, did you, or is there a difference in which types of assessment predominate in what type of autonomy quadrant? As in, maybe some assessment will have more weightage towards the final grade, or some will be summative, some will be formative, and so they will tend to cluster in a particular part of the Cartesian plane, or you don't see this?
Yeah. So what I've done is, because I've got those individual profiles, I can link the assessment practices, as in an exam or a group work or a formative or a summative. I can link up those different types of assessment with the profile of the person who has undertaken the interview. So eventually I would be able to kind of filter and say, well, here's all the perceptions of people who do exams. Well, here's all the perceptions of people who don't do exams. I'm not there yet, but I would be able to do that at the end, yeah. Because it's all in Excel, so I can just filter on a whole different load of different factors. So I'll kind of go on to get through my translation device, because I know I've probably taken it.
So now we're going to do the bit where we're going to you're going to circle back to that thing in a minute, and then we'll understand it this time. Cool.
I might be doing a tour, Carl. I never thought of that. Or am I waving? I don't know.
Possibly not. I'm not sure. That's not really. This is all semantics at the moment, not autonomy. So I don't know. We're going to come back to that later, to make sense of that. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So how did I get there? So 28 interviews at Case University UK, undertaken in 2021. So just after the pandemic. Looking at 2 disciplines, so accounting is one, business management is another. Business management is a combination of different disciplines, so it's not a clear-cut discipline, but if you wanted to draw kind of Bigler and Becker differences, then maybe accounting is a bit more hard and business is a bit more soft, and they both tend to be more applied. In terms of progress so far, I've probably only got about 10 interviews fully coded. I've got little bits and pieces in there from other people, but I haven't got the full 28, so that's a bit of a limitation at the moment. So it's just early findings. But the unit of analysis that I've analysed using Autonomy are paragraph responses from interview questions. And sometimes in a paragraph, people will make multiple points. I've had to split it out, but I've analysed over 600 paragraphs so far. So that's all the kind of plotting that you've seen. In terms of my theoretical framework, kind of got critical realism in the background, just critical realism acknowledging that there is a layer of the empirical, so there are people's perceptions and there is a reality, and different people have different perceptions of potentially a quite similar reality because they experience it differently. So I am mapping out perceptions of practices, and they can be quite different depending on that individual. I'm using LCT and I'm using LCT Autonomy. I played around with Bourdieu and Bernstein, but for the whole size of the thesis, I'm just kind of focusing in on LCT Autonomy really, and just using Bourdieu as a way of seeing the field, and going back to Carl's 2005 article, whereby he looks at positions and position takings, and I've kind of stuck with those influences, if you like. So I've used LCT, as I've said. I won't go into what LCT is, because I think most people are pretty clear with what LCT is. And the reason why I chose LCT was because it breaks down different dichotomies. So I know Carl would probably hate a Venn diagram. I know, judging by the constellation. Unless
you discuss what the overlaps mean,
I know.
It is something that I believe should never be allowed.
I know, I do. I cringed when I wrote it. But essentially, I see kind of 3 different dichotomies that permeate educational research and permeate assessment research. And as Pavel, you mentioned in the beginning, there's a kind of charging associated with each one. So in the assessment world, there's a charging saying summative assessment of learning is bad, and I'm generalizing here, okay, bad. Formative assessment for learning is good, and we need to transition and move away from one or the other. And those dichotomies and those charging, they have inferences for disciplinary assessment practices, because in the disciplines, the hard disciplines tend to be more objective, knowledge-based assessment methods, so exams, multiple choice, etc. And the soft disciplines tend to be I'll say like more flowery, more creative, more reflective, various different types of assessments that are more predominant in the soft disciplines. So you almost get this kind of charging, this axiological dichotomy formulating in disciplines as well. And so it almost feels as though hard disciplinary practice is bad because it aligns with maybe assessment of learning, summative assessment, and kind of knowledge-based assessment. Whereas the softer disciplines engage in a lot more kind of socio-constructive type assessment, more focus on the learner. And again, I'm generalizing, but the overlap here is that these dichotomies and these one is good, one is bad tend to permeate through both assessment and disciplinary type discourse. And they also permeate as well in research and practice. So research is one thing, practice is another, and they often don't meet up. And research is the kind of the highly valued and the practice isn't as good. So those are my, that's my reason for using LC2, to break apart these dichotomies, especially the assessment dichotomy really, and to find a new way of viewing assessment practice that doesn't rely on disciplinary approaches. So that's why I've got those kind of three problems there. I'm using autonomy, and in terms of autonomy, I've given you a hint around positional and relational autonomy. So positional autonomy is all around constituents in one context or category and the insulation from other constituents in other contexts and other categories. And relational autonomy is around the way in which they work, for example. So constituents in my study I've deemed as the source of assessment design decisions. So tends to really relate to the academic as the primary source of influence in assessment, whereas other constituents or other actors in the field of assessment practice could have influence. So accreditation bodies, management, students, they could all exert influence on assessment in some way. And the means of relation are around those assessment beliefs being for learning, or assessment beliefs and principles being around some other concept, whether that's kind of more economic concepts. And I'm not going to say employability, because employability I'll come on to is appears in kind of different guises, but more so assessment as being a tool or a function or just a means to an end without necessarily a learning component. So I have to have a target, and I had a bit of trouble kind of setting this target because educational assessment is so disparate and contested that I really struggled to nail down what the target was and how to look at strengths from that. But essentially a target from the definition is what constitutes, what constituents and principles are considered constitutive of this context and this time. So the target derives from the data, and in the data, I was hearing that control and autonomy should be with the module leaders. And then there was also a little bit about this kind of blue sky thinking about what assessment should be. And assessment should be preparing students for their future lives. It should be aligned with the purpose of HE around this kind of adding value, creating these kind of autonomous citizens to go out into society and make a change. So quite liberal ideas around what assessment and what education should do, and they're quite intertwined. When you start asking people about the purpose of assessment and how it relates to the purpose of higher education, they had these quite blue sky thinkings, and sometimes they aligned and sometimes they didn't. So sometimes they were quite liberal expressions of what education should be, but assessment detracted from that learning, and assessment wasn't part of that conversation. But generally, the target is set as assessment enabling this kind of liberal, autonomous, academic education, if you like. And that did align with
Natalie, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
I was just thinking, you know, in a sort of outward-facing discipline like accounting or law or engineering, where, in your case, accounting, where it's possible that you have academics within the field, sort of teaching and so on, but they come from professional practice. So you have a mix of academics who are sort of come through the traditional route and they're internal and so on, but then you also have people that have come from outside. You could imagine in principle that there might be clashes in terms of the articulation of the sovereign, that you have people that are based in professional practice, and so they're their ideas about what assessment is for come from without, if you like. Did that not emerge in the data? Did you have relatively uniform articulation of what the purpose was?
Yeah, that did emerge in the data. So that's why I had to take a pretty broad definition of what relational autonomy was. So I set relational autonomy as being for the purposes of education. So the more practice-based academics might say assessment is for employability. Assessment should link to creating transferable skills for the labour market. And that was a valid rationale associated with education for assessment for learning, assessment for education. So what I've had to do, and in the translation device, you'll probably see this coming out, is join up those two kind of concepts, even though they could be quite contested, liberal versus employability, but they're both bound by being for education and not for some other purpose, like efficiency of marking, for example, or just for certification with no learning concept. So I've had to place both of those in the sovereign, but the employability outlook is a little bit, and I don't want to use the word weakly classified, but it's a little bit weaker in relational autonomy than the liberal, but it's still in the sovereign. So I've had to kind of set it up that way. And then if academics completely disagree with the liberal or completely disagree with the kind of employability notion for learning, then I've also had to accommodate for them by showing the disagreements in a non-target way. So okay, I'll go on to how I've kind of done those kind of disagreements, but essentially that target I've set as quite broad in that the influence comes from the academic and the practices are perceived as being learning or educational. And in terms of what that learning...
Can I just jump in, Natalie, and say, yeah. Well, I'm not going to ask, I'm not asking, I am just jumping in. Please, anybody just jump in at any time. Yeah, one of the things that is just a useful thing to point out to people is that the notion of target is like all LCT concepts, like all the organizing principles, all the codes, all the analytics, like profiling, planes, pathways, all of them fractal. And so, you know, the setting of the center of the plane for autonomy, as it were, which is enabled by target, is you know, this is kind of gives us a sense of where those things are going to be, those axes, can be big scale. So it's not in any way, shape, or form the sense of it being fuzzier because it's bigger. If you can, you know, once one's got a sharp definition, it can be at a very big scale. So one of the things that's a problem when introducing these concepts is they've all been introduced in the context of studies. And then people tend to think that that's the sort of study it has to be for, whereas the concepts all and analytics are all designed to be used in any kind of study. So yeah, just because those were developed in the context of very fine-grained classroom discourse sort of stuff doesn't mean you can't do what you've done, which is, you know, big targets. So don't feel bad about the targets being big, you know, because you may need them that big. You know, there's nothing that says it has to be so incredibly tiny scale. It can be on a big macro scale. It's just about clarity of definition, which you might find sharpening up over time. I always find that my definitions are pretty woolly to begin with, and they sharpen up over time with the back and forth between data and theory to the point where they do get sharper. And that's one of the things that people don't ever tell you, is they see, people only see the product, which gets to this really sharp definition of something, and they don't notice, they don't tell you the process of that period in which, you know, it was sharp, you know, it was sharp at one point, then it had to be loosened up because it didn't work, and then it had to be tightened again, and then loosened up because it didn't work, and it tightened again. It is a messy process until you get to the end of it. So don't feel bad about that.
Yeah, and just to
I'm saying that to everyone as well. That's a kind of like, I'm saying that to everybody. It's like, you know, it is a real process of back and forward on that sort of thing. Yeah.
And just to go back, I was more influenced from the kind of early work that you did on autonomy, the 2005, like who is in control of HE and for what principles, than the kind of the content purpose type approach that came out a bit later for autonomy. So I don't
To
know
be
if that
honest,
has come.
there's a part of me that almost wrote, I don't know if I did, I think I drafted an email to the forum saying if I could delete and eradicate that paper off the planet, I would. But
I love that paper.
I think it's because I would like to go back and say, this is only one way of enacting these concepts. This is only one way of doing this. And they were completely stripped down and renovated between then and now, because that's all they were back then. But now they're able to be used for anything. So it's not as if they're incompatible. It's just, it was no way of being able to use them properly, I don't think, then as they are now. But now we can see that old paper in the light of the new one, and then it makes more sense than it did at the time. But they're just different ways of doing things.
I'm sorry. I'll just kind of speed up a little bit because I know we're getting on with time. So essentially, the target.
Oh, sorry about that. I'm also going to. Did I say I'm making this worse for you, because I'm going to say that was one of those papers I did because I got bored. I think I told people that I was supposed to write a paper about Bourdieu's autonomy, and I got really bored writing about it, so I just introduced LCT instead.
Well, that's the basis of my thesis, so thank you. So the target kind of aligns with this kind of blue skies notion somewhat, but also includes more kind of liberal ideas. So in terms of what I'm plotting both practices and perspectives. So if somebody says I'm doing authentic assessment, then I plot that as authentic assessment, aligning with kind of that relational autonomy, that target. And so if somebody says a perspective on practice, so employability narrative is rubbish, then I'd have to also plot that perspective, and that would be plotted as a disagreement with this target. So I'm plotting both kind of practices and perspectives on practices in some way. So in terms of positional,
sorry, Natalie, just a very tiny point. When you talk about their actual practices, you should be saying you're plotting their reported practices, because I don't think you're going and studying their actual practices, are you?
No, I do have a question where I ask them what their practices are, but I don't observe them or anything like that.
Exactly. So just reported,
Fab. So in terms of positional autonomy, then I got to find a way of kind of looking at those strengths and to plot them, if you like. So in terms of strengths, I thought, well, academic influence is kind of strong positional autonomy, and then that weakens as you go outside, if you like. So I know we've always got agency and we've always got structure, but it's the relativeness of those. So academic agency with the individual academic, and then whether the influence comes from outside their kind of immediate academic community, or whether it comes from the institution, or whether it comes from like accreditation bodies that are linked to the institution, or whether it comes from outside. So that ultimately helped me set my translation device. So my translation device in terms of strong positional autonomy was that influence came from the academic, and I'll say the word habitus, like their kind of history, their own experience, their beliefs, so their family influence, for example, or whether it came from the community of academics. And then weaker positional autonomy is whether it comes from outside academia. So it could be in the same institution, but it's more from management, or it's more from their students or accreditation bodies, or from industry, economy, employers, etc. So I do have some data just to kind of show you how I came up with that translation device and some quotes. I won't go into it in too much detail, but an academic saying, I think of assessment how I'd like my children to be assessed, or I assess how I was assessed, my training as an academic, my pedagogic training. So all of those would constitute coming from that kind of individual academic, whereas if they were influenced by other colleagues, that would be a little bit weaker, or if they were influenced by the nature of the discipline they're in, that would also be a little bit weaker. And then as you get out to kind of PA minus, we're looking at maybe the environmental factors of the institution, so student numbers as being an influence, or management as being an influence, or maybe kind of external pedagogic kind of conferences, not internal pedagogic training, but that external pedagogic arena, if you like. And the very wide one is like employers. Yeah.
And so I was just going to ask, why is the individual academic, stronger PA than than the pedagogic norms? Just, I mean, I'm not saying it's not right. I'm just saying why is that? Just out of interest.
I think because the individual academic in my practice, in my research, came out as having kind of full control and basically could do whatever they wanted. And I wanted to find out what the reasons were for them doing whatever they wanted. And a lot of it came out from the way they were assessed. So the target
No,
really...
I'm not asking that. I'm asking why is one stronger than the other for PA? So why is the one you've called academic? Why is that double plus? Why is disciplinary pedagogic norms plus?
Because it's based on like the individual or the wider community. So some people would say academic as a collective we, so us as academics, they'd relate to the academic profession rather than me as an individual. So I had to differentiate between them.
I know the difference between the two. I'm asking why one's stronger than the other. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just like, I don't know why. So I mean, one of the things that is really important is we always tend towards defining what's in the boxes, but actually what's the most important thing is the line between them. So what is it that's dividing those two things? One is stronger than the other because
there's an infiltration of influence from a wider community. So if you look at like an academic as being the centre, the one individual who's responsible for enacting assessment practice, for example, then if they're taking influence from within or from outside of themselves, if you like. So that's why it's weaker as you go outside.
Right. So yeah, and I mean, because you're really focused on the individual, aren't you? I mean, like in terms of things like agency and so on, is that your concern might be with individual academics, but you've just got to make it so. Can you go back one, by the way? Just back one to the simpler thing, which is, so assessments are from academia.
Because I think their own experience is very personal to them. It forms part of their habitus. I know that the pedagogy...
I want to know why PA is inside. Now, I'm just trying to figure out. So like, rather than describe them endlessly, there's a simple reason for why one's stronger than another, why one's stronger, why is one more, like inside whatever your target is. And it's like, it's never found by describing the examples even more. It's just why, is it because the person is your target? Is that the person as an academic, the individual as the individual academic, right? So then make sure, right, so then the top one is the individual academic, and then the second one is academic. So therefore, okay, so you've got, so if it's the individual academic, so I like to get things really fucking, really bloody simple.
Yeah.
I have to watch out for YouTube. All my normal swearing has to be calmed down. So yeah, if it's like the individual, so this is just for me. I'm not saying you have to put it in the translation device or something, but just for my brain, I think, okay, so PA plus is going to be individual academic for whatever reason, because of your focus and problem situation or whatever. And then like, okay, so double plus is individual academic, and then just single plus is academic.
Yeah.
So like, okay, I can see that then. I've got the full thing here, and I've got part of it here, or it might even be, I don't know if you get this data, but it might be the individual as an academic, right? And then it might be academic, like disciplinary, or the individual not as an academic. I don't know if that would even appear. But I mean, it's just like, the reason why I'm asking this is because every single minus on a fractal basis, so the plus minus, and then you got double plus, so it's like another plus minus inside, and then you can keep going. Every single one is always defined by the plus, and the minus bit, the lesser bit, is always whatever else there is, right?
Yeah.
So it's like plus is the academic, individual, or whatever, and then minus is anything else. For example, industry, government, whatever else it might be. It might not be just industry, it might be all sorts of shit as you've got there. And then you've got, and then inside plus, it kind of goes, okay, individual academic, anything else that's something to do with academia, kind of, I suppose. As so, yeah. I don't know if you get the individual just as a not academic, but but that makes sense for me anyway. Individual academic, academic influences, which often are, e.g., disciplinary. In your data, you're finding them as being disciplinary influences.
Yeah.
So as Cara is trying to make it simple in his mind, trying to make it more complicated in my mind, because I still have very raw memories of coding my data for my PhD, and real life data can be devilishly complex, and you have to make decisions, right? So I mean, looking at this table, what if you have somebody who believes that the purpose of education is to prepare students for the outside world, right? Or who would say, okay, I test students in this way because I was tested in that way, but that way relied on somebody's belief that education should prepare you for the industry or for economy, right? Would that still be PA++?
I think that's, I think you've just done both PA and RA, but I'll let Natalie answer that, because I think you just did both in one.
Yeah, and I think that's where the kind of the positions and the position takings and the separation of PA and RA, it posed difficulties for me, because I had to isolate or identify that PA that they were using when they were talking about something. So if somebody was talking about assessment for employability, they might say, oh, when I worked in whatever company in the UK, I firmly believe that, I used whatever experience I had in my job, and I firmly believe that students need to know this. So then I would say, okay, well, that PA comes from the academics' past experience in practice. Mm-hmm. So this is a very kind of simplified TD, but I did have a little bit more of a granular understanding around when the academics talking, are they talking from kind of their research identity, if you like, their research background, or are they talking more from their work experience background? And then hopefully, due to those intricacies, I'll be able to say, well, okay, the majority of academics that talked about employability in this way have a work background, or the majority of academics who talk about liberal, critical kind of assessment have a research background. Generalizing, but I do have that granular level detail in that I could identify. So in my scale of PA, it's quite granular, and I'd be able to tease out the differences between academics talking from a kind of a research background or a research head-on. If they say, well, from my research, I think that students should be able to challenge managerial practice, or they might say, from my experience in work, they should be able to do this task, and I can try and differentiate between the two. So I hope that answers. I'll skip on, because I thought PA was quite okay, but RA was where the trouble was. So relational autonomy, I've deemed, and I've taken some influence from Pat Locke's work, and I know you wrote a paper with him, Carl, and I think he used the kind of general.
He was my PhD student.
Yeah. So I've taken his approach for RA and used the kind of general educational, not non-educational, but other purposes, even though it was more set out as educational, possibly economic purposes in kind of Pat's work. But I've used that distinction to some way. So anything associated with learning would be RA+. Anything that related to other practices. So if assessment was seen as kind of spoon feeding, and not necessarily this deep idea of learning, but coaching students to just pass that test, then that had a lesser kind of learning quality than assessment that enabled kind of human flourishing and emancipatory kind of assessment, if you like. So on RA, I've got this kind of scale from liberal learning at the very one end, going down to kind of a learning with a future focus, then a learning with a current focus, then a learning with a more kind of instrumental targeted type focus, then into PA- as assessment that is just deemed as focused on administrative, technical kind of tasks and focus. So if assessment was just talked in terms of reliability, robustness, marking, that activity, regardless of the student's learning, that would sit as a more weaker RA. And then if assessment was just deemed as credentialism and end game, nothing to do with learning, then that would be the opposite scale. And so if you're looking at using assessment for marking purposes, for efficiency, for workload, for example, then that would be a weaker relational autonomy.
So
in
you're
terms
gonna,
of
your biggest challenge here is going to be describing this in a way that does not make it sound as if you're valorizing the right-hand side and dissing the left. So it's going to be all about saying, you know, this is the way in which the participants, you know, define or something else, something defines what makes this space distinctive from something else, makes it particularly educational, and then to try and avoid, you know, making it sound as if you're saying, I have this idea of what learning should be, and then you're matching to it. So somehow connecting it up to something, you know, that at least can make it very clear that it's not your, because there's so much work out there, right? So take anything, so much in ed tech, for example, or anything in, say, big fields like CSCL and stuff, where it is just a non-stop propaganda model for collaborative student learning of a particular kind. And you know, it's all taken as read, as assumed that's the be all and end all. And that's not what you're doing here. It's not at all. You're just trying to define the degree of strength of boundary between X and Y. So just as long as you keep that kind of way of describing it when you're doing it vocally and also in your PhD, because I can't mind on your PhD and how it might be read.
Yeah.
It's just as long as you kind of get that sense of why boundaries are stronger or weaker, that's going to be the case of setting the target somewhere and then saying, okay, from that target, dun, this is weaker and this is weaker and this is weaker. But otherwise it'll sound like you're kind of going, I like this, and this is further and further away from what should be the case. And one of the things that people misunderstand about the notion of target is that they seem to think, oh, that's, you know, what we should be aiming for or something.
Yeah.
And I always say, no, it's what you say you're aiming for. I don't give a shit.
Yeah, and I did struggle. Yeah, I struggled with kind of generalizing the target because, as you'll see in the data, so many different perspectives were not on target. So weaker relational autonomy might be doing assessment to make students happy. And there might be linkages between happiness and learning, but predominantly doing assessment to keep students happy or doing assessment to meet regulatory guidance, they're valid rationales. They just are not focused on the kind of the student and their individual kind of learning and the flourishing, for example. So
Natalie and Carl, this is a question I think for both of you, or either. Does the target have to exist within the data? Like my feeling will be that it's not necessary for it to be present in the data. So like it could be maybe like a pure position, like from a Bourdieuian point of view, it's like the purest idealized version of a highly autonomized, field, like in terms of education, like what's the completely idealized, completely fully autonomical educational purpose, which may not be present in the data in itself, or because that will allow you like that, and to me that will be speaking to the whole space of possibles that Carl always talks about in LCT, and which allows also like the whole critical outlook on what's going on, not necessarily from a moral or axiological viewpoint, but okay, so this is what could be, I don't know if that makes sense, and I don't know what both of you think, whether it's better to put the stopgap in what's present in the data as the target, or look beyond. I don't know.
Shall I answer? I struggled with this exact point because I wanted to develop a translation device that other people could use. So I wanted to map out all possibilities, but I kept coming back to literature that said the target has to be data driven. So I don't know if I resolved it by the iterative back and forth. So I found some nuggets of data that were this kind of idealized target. And that matched with some of the literature on that idealized target. And I don't want to say idealized because there's value attribution again, like axiological charging. But I think I was lucky to find a few people who did say that target, because I was seeking it out, because in my mind I wanted this target from the literature. So I struggled with it. And I'm just grateful that I found some data for it, but I don't know if Carl's got an answer as to what would have happened if I didn't find any data for it.
It's really simple, actually. It's two things. Translation devices for, look, this is how I analyze this data, right?
Okay.
So it's the data. And to that end, I should say, by the way, that like all great stories, all great narratives, movies, things like that, their general import for us as humans tends to be because they've gone very specific. So the more specific they go, often the more general we end up getting something out of it, because they've really shown us something rich and deep about life and what it is to be human, or whatever it might be, however tiny that focus is. And it's the same thing as you said earlier on, I really want somebody to be able to use this. Well, the way they'll be able to use this is if you do a really, really bang up job of analyzing your data, and then they can go, oh, well, that's what she did for that data. Well, what's my data like that's different? And I can really see the differences, rather than like, oh, yeah, you try and go bland and wide and as big as you can and try and imagine other things as well. And then you've got this kind of blanded out stuff that kind of matches your data and doesn't really, and has one eye on other things that you're not really focused on. You're trying to imagine at that point. So just go deep and rich and as specific as possible. And the target should be done, you know, the target is simply a case of, the other thing is that the target's only there for setting the plane, as it were, for setting pluses and minuses, because there is no other way of doing it otherwise. It's like what's in or out of some set of practices is always up for debate and can often be subject to great contestation and misunderstandings and so on. So you've got to kind of go, okay, for analyzing this, I'm going to set the plane here, because these pluses and minuses, they're just a way of being enable and relational analysis. That's all. Relational, relative strengths, that sort of stuff. So we're just pinning our zero somewhere and going, this is going to be zero for us, you know, and then because in this data, that's what it is. So it comes from within. And of course, the critical side of things, best possible, that Mauricio brought up is a really good point, which is, you know, that by going very specific about this thing and then being very clear about the limits of that analysis, in the sense of not limits as in limitations, but this is what it's about. And then saying there are other potential ways of seeing this, there are other possibilities, and so on and so on. You know, always being aware of things that could be beyond your data, and not overgeneralizing and saying, so therefore this is the translation device for everything, and things like that, or this is the analysis, this is the autonomy plane for everybody. So it's just that case of being like really having the capacity to get really big implications from your work comes from being almost like seriously focused on what you're doing there, and just remembering that it's just on that thing, you know, but doing it really fucking good on that thing. I'm not sure if I've made any sense. It's 5:15 here and I'm losing my ability to think.
I know,
Karina.
I'm so sorry. Did someone have?
Yes, it's me. I keep being struck by, I think there are a lot of similarities here with spaces like engineering, for example, which is so heavily accreditation, professional body oriented. Okay. So somehow those people, same as the health sciences, you know, they see assessment practices differently. You know, the whole active learning, the constructivist stuff that you had front end is the kind of stuff that the hardcore engineers would poo-poo, because you need 100% against a strict test for safety in a lab or in an environment. There's no touchy-feely, you can't experiment with a fire to feel the implications, so to understand the dangers, you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's audit process, it's like the audit process. That was just one comment. But what I'm thinking in terms of the autonomy plane and the way you've used it is that, yes, you're taking the individual agency, as in really interpreting autonomy as the agency of that academic in that position doing this assessment. I'm just wondering about, I would have seen the convergence of the field of practice or the community of practice, the rules of the game of the field that there is consensus around as being the stronger positional autonomy, you know, and academics speaking from within the safety of the bounds of a really consensual community of practice as being stronger than the individual. I'm just wondering about, do you know what I'm saying?
I think I'm challenging what that consensual practice is, because I want to break apart from the generalizations of what that consensual practice is. Because in accounting, yes, there might be the general view that you've got to sit a 3-hour exam, it's right or wrong, it's objective. And that does stem from the disciplinary side of things, and it is a disciplinary practice, I agree. But you will find individuals in there who completely disagree with that consensus. And I want to, and those individuals like stick out like a sore thumb. They're trying to be critical, they're trying to be liberal, they're trying to be new in an environment where tradition is the exam and tradition is objective. And that really is the whole point. I came from my experience. That's the whole point, is trying to understand individual beliefs around assessment and where they come from. And if they're more deeply rooted in disciplinary allegiances, then that would just be that PA plus, a little bit weaker. Whereas if they come from elsewhere, then that would be PA plus plus. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
you two have just given a fantastic example of how translation devices are driven by problem situations, which is your question, Natalie, is all about individuals and their autonomy and so on. And I can imagine a study that, say, for example, Green was doing another study in which your problems and your questions drive the target to be a particular thing because of the questions you're asking and the problems you're looking at, which then leads to the disciplinary thing being stronger because of the different target here, the different thing that's being looked at. And that's the wonderful thing about this, is that that one always has to say, in the light of my question. So I always say problem situation, because it's not just the object of study, which, you know, kind of fairly lame, kind of very shallow understanding of things like critical realism would like push over and over again. It's about the object of study. Objects of study are nothing. It's the problems you're asking of them that construct them in particular ways. And it's that problem situation, it's the problem that's the real thing that drives the way in which you construct the object of study. And so the translation device for one will be different to another. The target for one will be different to another. That's the marvelous thing about the tools, is that they can be used for any of those. And they're not like models of anything. Like, for example, in the same way you would have an SFL model of this, which would then people would argue and then fix. In this case, you could say have the same thing, assessments being analyzed by you, and your questions, like Natalie's questions, drive the individual to be the double plus, and somebody else's questions drive the disciplinary things to be double plus, because of the different thing that you're trying to solve, because they're just tools for solving problems, not making little models of anything.
Yeah.
Sorry, Natalie, I just want to comment on what Carl's just said. And as you were speaking, realizing, and this is why I'm so in love with the epistemic plane, because the epistemic plane is kind of the overarching model of the LCT dimensions, because in essence, the instruments themselves are underpinned by kind of a purist insight in terms of what it is. And what Carl has just described was from a purist perspective of the what it is, the phenomenon you're trying to address and how. But each of our context and problem situations is, you know, demands situational insight and interpretation relative to the problem you're trying to solve. You know, the tools themselves are underpinned by doctrinal insight in terms of how you might use or apply them. It constantly navigates towards the situation. And all of this is in service of kind of sociocultural practices, players in the field, in the autonomy plane, sitting in the knower or no insight. So sometimes you might see a study that has no clearly defined problem situation or target or any of these things, which would then reveal no insight. Just saying, I love this. Cool. Take it away,
that's so
Natalie.
nicely put, Corinne. That's so well put.
That's how I see it.
Oh, you've
That's
muted
how
yourself now.
once you see, you see. You can't unsee. Just saying.
Just so I mean, I know time is going on. Can I just very quickly just show you a few different individual profiles,
Just
and
keep
then
going,
I'll kind of
and then people
close.
just leave when they have to.
Okay. So I've skipped through a few slides around just breaking up the translation device to account for disagreements, because what I've positioned as target, people will outrightly disagree with, and what comes out in the data as learning, another individual would disagree with. So I've had to accommodate for direct disagreements. And I've also had to accommodate for absences. So if somebody says authentic assessment is great and I want to do an authentic assessment for learning, but we don't have it and therefore it doesn't help learning, I've had to accommodate for those absences of practices as well, because I'm capturing all those perspectives. So I just wanted to kind of show you, I've used different colours for the disagreements and the absences and things like that, but I'll just show you very quickly some of the output. So this is all the normative, this is in the sovereign code, and these are all the normative perspectives of assessment. And you can see that they're quite sporadic, so there'll be a cluster around employability and a cluster around measurement and a cluster around liberal. So by looking very intricately at the detail in the sovereign, you'll see where the different perceptions of what's valued as learning, if you like, fall. And in terms of the focus and the basis, this is where you'll start seeing the different discourses. So employability is like the focus, or authentic assessment is the focus. So authentic assessment can come up in any quadrant, but the basis is it deemed as being educational, or is it deemed as being kind of a disagreement or non-educational, or is it absent? So I've skipped over those slides, but that's something else I wanted to just say. And in terms of normative perceptions, whilst the majority is in this kind of RA plus around being for student learning, then there are other people that say, well, no, we should be focused on this, or we should be focused on marking and regulatory guidance, and we should have, I don't know, narrow assessment practices for accreditation, for example. So it's not all kind of everything in one quadrant. And so what I've done then is I've looked at individual profiles, as I've said. So I've constructed individual profiles for various people. And even just by looking at this, you'll see a scattering in certain quadrants and maybe not so much in another. So this is Bob, who was in accounting and finance and did exams and had a kind of clear focus on, also did some coursework, but a focus on employability. So there were clusters in the sovereign around assessment and HE being for employability and learning, but there were also clusters in this exotic. And when I said about absence as a basis of legitimation, there's one little example here, as you can see by here. This is where the influence doesn't come from inside. So the influence doesn't come from the academic. And this individual has deemed that as kind of detrimental to learning. So they've said the absence of colleagues not having a consensual influence over assessment means that it's non-innovative practice. So for example, so this allows me to deal with situations whereby people are directly commenting on, this is the influence from the outside, if you like, but there's also an absence of influence from the inside. And so I know that's quite, like, I've thrown it in last minute, but I've had to just use my translation device to account for where influence comes from inside and where influence comes from outside, but also where influence doesn't come from inside or doesn't come from outside, because that's the basis, really. And I did have an earlier slide when I said there's a difference between an academic saying, I have autonomy and I do it in this way, or they shouldn't have autonomy. So either I should undertake assessment for this purpose, or they shouldn't. And so I just differentiated between those, really. And that's why there's different layers of the device. So, so different people have different profiles. So I showed you this one earlier. So this one's largely in the exotic. Carl was a bit of a splattering everywhere, and had different reasons. And a lot of the issues down here for Carl were that he very much supported assessment that was focused on robustness.
Why have you given this respondent the name Carl?
With a K?
Yeah.
I asked people to choose.
Misunderstanding at this point.
I asked people to choose the pseudonyms, and I might have made this one up.
Give it at least a C with a Carl. Oh my God. And you know, people think this is me saying this.
I know. The oppressed academic, that's you, Carl. So this is Carl, who's the oppressed academic, and basically, feels there's too much agency. So up in this projected, there's too much agency, not enough support, and they have to undertake practices that they deem are in contrast to learning. So, this, when I said argument with some of the learning, so saying that if learning should be innovative, practices, these are saying that we have too much agency and therefore it's not innovative. Our assessment is not authentic, and therefore is not focused on learning. So I've done that for various people. Owen was an institutionalized liberal, so very, very kind of high up in the sovereign, really pushing this kind of liberal idea, but had a bit of a balance on liberal, and also very much believed in collaboration with outside influences. So getting the students on board, getting linkages with industry, and also having kind of managerial input into assessment design. So that's what I did. And ideally, I'd like to think, could I then use this in some way to relook at the disciplines and see if those disciplinary boundaries have different profiles or whether they're kind of similar? And there is a little bit of kind of difference, as you can see, between accounting and business. Maybe some of this over here, a lot more kind of negative aspects around influence coming from outside being deleterious for learning. Those few ones are by there. And again, as I showed you in the beginning, clustering them all up to try to identify some form of predominant belief systems or predominant cultures. And I've ended up with, maybe, I know Carl doesn't agree with this either, like labeling quadrants as something different, but those bubbles, these bubbles here, I could try to say what they represented. So for example, in the sovereign, we've got a culture of contested learning. So some bubbles are kind of employability based, some bubbles are more liberal based. They're all for learning, but they're different guises of learning. And sometimes that tension plays out in the RA minus in terms of those disagreements. The exotic is all around constraint and conflict. So a lot of the managerialist discourse came in here where management had influence, but it was kind of deleterious for learning. And also education bodies were not necessarily seen as learning, and all that outside influence. Whereas up in the projected is a cultural foundation here in terms of academics having autonomy and having academic freedom, but actively having to adopt principles and practices that they saw as being against those learning concepts, if you like, being in disagreement to those learning concepts because of the constraints that they were under. So some academics said, I'd love to do stuff, but I've just got to engage in either tradition or practices to fit in with colleagues, nothing to do with student learning, or practices to reduce my marking workload because I have to survive. So that was the kind of self-conservation, self-preservation culture. And down in here is the culture of cooperation, where academics see that they need to work with students, with accreditation bodies, with industry, in order to create those kind of assessments for learning. And that's 8:31, and that's me. So I've taken up every minute of your time. And I know I whizzed through those findings, but I just wanted to
we had loads and loads of great chat on the way. This is exactly how it should be, which is to have loads of interruptions and chat and discussion and along the way. It's like it's about the it's about the process, you know, it's about the journey, not just the destination of the last
the last slide. Get into the last slide.
The last slide. Yeah, exactly. The boss battle at the end. It's all about the fun all along the way, and all those the issues and questions and things brought up along the way, which is great. You know, has anybody got anything they want to jump in with, or say, or suggest, or?
Natalie, yeah, it's Lee. I'd be really interested in your, you know, your Bob or your Carl or whoever, whether there's any kind of pathways. You know, I'm in the situation, and these are my conflicts, but I'm operating, but I mean, your data is not kind of tracking over time, so I can't see that there would be pathways would be a useful thing here, but the spreads give, you know, kind of tell you that story about how they're kind of moving, how they're working across different quadrants, and you know, I'm just trying to get us a grip on that.
Yeah, there are some linkages. So, for example, one academic said, I did a closed book exam and it wasn't helping learning, but then COVID came along, so this kind of real outside influence, and it helped me because I could change my exam to coursework, and that was really great for learning. So you can do a little bit of an autonomy pathway, but I didn't incorporate them. I've more looked at it from, I would have, rather than that being a pathway of 3, that would appear in my analysis as 3 kind of dots, if you like, but without that joined up thinking.
Perhaps, and I mean, it's just, I'm just throwing it out, you know, if once you are doing your kind of your interpretation, and you come to your four cultures, and being a narrative like that, why would it be useful? Because particular assessment narratives or whatever can be tracked, you know. I'm not sure, but it was just a thought.
I don't think, I mean, like, as you said,
no, I did think of that.
There's no kind of sequence of changes here, so it's not the pathways, but distribution patterns is one of the things that has been very underused as yet. The plane is just designed to be able to see, if it's of interest, a kind of distribution pattern of data points within it. So, for example, you know, you could have a plane in which there's a really tight distribution pattern, you know, like all the data points are quite close to each other, and another one which is much laxer, and they're kind of like relaxed, and they're all over the shop, you know. And then you might have one in which people have several clumps, you know, like there's particular places around the plane that they've kind of gravitated towards and created their own little, it's like the universe, really, you know. You've got you could have a potential for there being a data point in every single point of the entire plane, like the universe, but actually there isn't. They would clump together into solar systems and, you know, galaxies and so on. And why is that? Why have they clumped together into those galaxies and those universities, those universes, those solar systems? Why have those things come together in that way? I think this is what you're looking at here, is the kind of, why do those things, or where are they clumping together? What are the solar systems or galaxies in the universe here? And then kind of trying to say, well, the nature of those galaxies are, this one's this type, this one's this type, this one this type. And then you have to just make sure that you don't sound as if you're putting people completely in one of them and saying they can never travel to another galaxy, as it were. But these are beliefs rather than people. These are beliefs and practices rather than people.
Yeah. Yes, they are, because one person has multiple beliefs and practices. And I think that was where I was kind of coming from with the individual academic, and then various different quadrants, or they could be clustered. And that's what I was looking at from the individual basis, but I have to consolidate them as well. I think my internet's gone.
It's getting a bit ropey, yes. I think it's telling us
that
that's
is.
time. Thank you so much, Natalie. That's awesome. That's really interesting.